Hello, I am David Tivy, author of the book Lost Identity Research for Wellbeing. Prior to writing the book, I tried to set up a social enterprise called Leaf, and the basic idea there was that an individual can self-manage their well-being when they have three elements of the societal triangle. Element one is that for an individual to self-manage their well-being, they must have a professional and personal identity. Part two is that society must accept the individual, i.e., there must be social norms within the community which allows the individual to be part of the community and have a sense of belonging and a sense of inclusion. And the final part of the societal triangle is that the social norms and the social model of that community must be supported by the Scottish Government or any government through the social policy of that government area. As we are now approaching the Scottish Government's elections, what I want to do is to go over the manifestos of the third sector charities and explain why I believe my model of inclusion via the societal triangle is what we must do in order to move forward to create a good well-being scenario for every citizen in Scotland. Hello, I am David Tivy, author of the book Lost Identity, The Search for Wellbeing. So in the book I also talk about my long-term conditions of living with cancer. But what I wanted to do was to try to shape the Scottish Government's policy agenda to move towards a wellbeing circular economy that focuses on the implementation of a fourth sector social enterprise network. With the upcoming Scottish elections in 2026, that's exactly what I'm going to do, guys, between now and the Scottish Government elections. I'm going to look at the third sector manifestos. I say third sector, a number of third sector charity manifestos to see if they actually add up and do what they say in the tin in order to implement a social policy that works in the best interest of their members and of all members in the community. So we'll start with Inclusion Scotland's Manifesto for Inclusion 2026. Ask 1 of the manifesto asked, or should I say demands, we demand independent living. And no one would disagree with that. But what exactly are we asking for? So we're asking for a review of the Independent Living Fund, which allows people with disabilities to live well in the community and in their own home. So if we focus on what was said at the SNP conference regarding GP walking, I've made this point before. People with disabilities require their carer to take them to the GP. So if that is not amended, I'm going to say that, if the policy regarding GP drop-ins is not amended to allow people with disabilities to set up a slot within the day where they can attend the drop-in, then I think it infringes probably on what has been asked here, which is independent living. Because if you have to go to a GP as an individual with disabilities, you've got to sit there until your time slot, but your carer has to leave. How do you get back home? Or how do you take transport, which may not be accessible, back to your house? So guys, that is what I would say here. there seems to be a differential between what the SNP, Scottish Government, are saying and what Inclusion Scotland are asking for. Ask 2 of Inclusion Scotland's Manifesto for Inclusion asks, or again demands, we demand an aggregate standard of living. And then there's three asks, but the one I'm interested in is the manifesto asks that the Scottish Government, next Scottish Government, remove care charges for non-residential support care, which pushes people with disabilities into poverty. Now, I actually volunteered for a charity which provides social care in Glasgow, and when this was brought in, they were outraged. And I kind of do agree with this. Disabled people should not be having to pay for their care. The care should be provided by the state as set out in the UN Conventions. However, if the Scottish Government and therefore city councils do not have the funds in order to supply support and care for people with disabilities who have their own home and require residential support, what is the alternative? If people are not being asked to pay a little bit of the charge from their own funds that is supplied by the UK Government's PIP or the Scottish Government's disability payment, where do we go? So again, I agree in principle with this ask. I just don't know what the alternative is, unless the Scottish Government will move towards a fourth sector social enterprise network, which allows us to basically focus on supplying support for local communities through fourth sectors and allowing the first sector to get funding from the Scottish Government where it is needed the most, i.e. to provide disabled people in their own home with residential care. In the book, I make the point that Microsoft Office, with its readback facility and Grammarly, do the exact same for me as a wheelchair does for someone who is wheelchair reliant. It allows me to be part of the community, provides me with good well-being and gives me an accurate standard of living. So if my copy of Grammarly and Word do that for me and I pay for that, shouldn't someone who requires a carer pay for the carer? The third ask in the manifesto, Inclusion Scotland's manifesto for Inclusion 2026, is we demand to be involved. And for a number of years, I've been involved in this sort of a campaign network to make sure that people with disabilities have access to communities, have access to stand as elected candidates, whether it be at council level or Scottish Government level. That is an issue around UK policy regarding people with disabilities to stand should be covered by the Equality Act 2010, which should allow the employer to make additional changes to the workplace to allow people with disabilities to stand. We're not seeing it so much at the moment. That is another campaign, however. So the one that I want to look at here is the first one that comes up. And it asks, involve disabled people's organisations. Should I say, involve disabled people's organisations in planning public spaces, e.g. when building local community hospitals, to ensure buildings, services and equipment are fully accessible. So at the moment, we are seeing far too many times that planning does not include people with disabilities. And it's simply because people with disabilities do not normally sit on community councils or community reference groups. So we do have to find a way in order to include people with disabilities in the plan. That is a community plan through community planning partnerships. How do community planning partnerships include more disabled people in their planning? So again, just the final one touches on the disability equality plan. So how do we include people with disabilities in a plan to give them more equality and more quality of life in the community, to make them heard, and for the elected politicians to understand what it is like to live in a community which is designed for and by non-disabled Euro-capital elected members of Parliament. The fourth ask in this manifesto, it's a manifesto for inclusion, written by Inclusion Scotland, asks, we demand education and employment. And that is a no argument debate there. People who have a disability, any disability at all, should be entitled to an education, should be entitled to learn, should be a member of the community, and should be entitled to employment. Covered by the Equality Act 2010 at a UK government level, people with disabilities should have access to employment. The Scottish Government should put in additional support where that employment need is not being met. Okay, so let's maybe return to my situation. As I said, I am the author of the book, Lost Identity, The Search for Wellbeing, and I'm currently still working in retail, having completed my master's degree in social innovation. I am currently looking for a position probably in social policy and research, but because I had learning disabilities as a child, and because I didn't start learning again until probably about the age of 18, I am at a severe disadvantage over my fellow graduates. So I would argue that I am at a disadvantage because I had a disability as a child. As someone with a master's degree, if I am working pretty much a non-skilled job with the skills I have, I think it's pretty much outrageous. Now, go back to disabled people themselves. They may not have had the opportunity for an education at a younger age, and there may be a little bit additional needs required to allow them to learn, but most people can learn. I had a medullary-blastoma. I had what you call Purfeuria-Forte syndrome, and I was able to learn as an adult. Everyone in society can learn. They just do so at their own speed. Therefore, everyone is entitled to a job, and it's a job that gives them good well-being and a good standard of living. Guys, this ask put forward by Inclusion Scotland is non-debatable. People with disabilities must have the right to an education, and they do have a right to an education, but they have the right to have an education, and they have the right to have a meaningful well-being that provides them with good well-being. Non-negotiable. The final ask of Inclusion Scotland's manifesto, a manifesto for inclusion, asks, or I said again, demands, we demand climate justice. And it goes on to suggest that there should be an introduction to a healthy environment which should be embedded in law, and disabled people should have a say in the design. It goes back to what I said before about people with disabilities being on local community councils and local area committees. That would go some way in order to embed the decisions that are made at a council level with people with disabilities having some say. In regards to the ELEAF bit here, which stands for Acquire, Learn, Educate, Associate, Fulfil, I think that ties in directly to what I was proposing after my master's degree, which is a social enterprise, fully funded social enterprise, would go some way in order to embed a policy where everyone in the community has a say in the development of the local community. So guys, any comments on how we introduce a climate justice for people with disability, or any of the other topics raised in the manifesto? Drop me a comment and let me know. Or alternatively, you can actually go to Inclusion Scotland's webpage, a website, and obviously let them know as well. Thank you guys. I will see you again. I look forward to having a meaningful discussion about how we embed disabled people's rights into law. What are my final thoughts on Inclusion Scotland's manifesto? Manifesto for Inclusion 2026. So I have been doing work with Inclusion Scotland and a number of other charities for a number of years. And of course I agree with what is said in this manifesto. I also think it works directly to support my model of inclusion through the societal triangle. Now, there's nothing in this which is too controversial. It does, in my opinion, ask Scottish Government to do some things that are reserved to Westminster, and is maybe knocking it down a little bit in regards to the overall rating which I would give it. But it's still a very solid manifesto, and therefore I would rate this manifesto in regard to the implementation of it, if you exclude potentially the financial levers that the Scottish Government would have and the monetary policies which may not be available, I would still rate this as a solid 8 out of 10 in regards to implementation and as a policy agenda which we should be moving forward with in the next parliamentary session in 2026 to 31, I believe, the parliamentary session 14. Thank you. I will see you in the next video.